So, part three of my conversation with Luca Rade, and we were talking about the grandmother feeling of the redwood forests under the influence of psychedelics of some kind previously. Um, how old were you when you first? We can come back to that specific moment if we wish. But how old were you when you had your first experience with psychedelics?
I was, I guess I was 20, and I was pretty lucky actually because my girlfriend at the time, um, she was really into psychedelics. She actually founded the psychedelics club at Princeton. I don't know if it still exists, but yeah. So it was while we were both there. It was we weren't dating at the time yet actually, but we were best friends. And she was like, since she was like 16, her dad was growing mushrooms under his bed, and she them, and then like things went from there. I think with him she did it or something, but so she had a whole history of having already taken them, and she knew a lot about them. And I was really skeptical. I was definitely not wanting to. I was kind of in a pretty rigid mindset, like I wanted to study history. I was. I mean, there were already like symptoms, so to say, of my uh, more open way of being that since emerged. Uh, but it was still, it hadn't, the shell hadn't fully cracked yet. But she ended up convincing me to take them, from talking about it for ages and ages. So I went in both with a very intimate loved one, and with a lot of knowledge, both from reading about it and from someone who'd taken them a lot,
Hmm.
and in a very safe environment. It was, it doesn't sound very safe. It was in a library, in the Princeton library, like in a private room. But it was the
Uh,
summer, so there was no one around really.
Copy.
And we booked it out for the whole day, so like it was ours to use for the whole day. And yeah, then we had the trip, and it was not at all what I expected. Obviously, it never is. Even now, whenever I take psychedelics, it's always a new thing from what you expect. Um, and yeah, I mean that's all I'll say about that first trip, I guess, except to say that it was uh, the the non-formalized context of it. I feel like was really really important. Like I think I would have had a very different relationship with psychedelics that would have been much worse if my first trip had been like with some professional facilitator, or with in a chair with music and my eyes blinded or something like that. It just I There's just something about the energy of psychedelics for me personally that is like antagonistic with, and it kind of inhibits their ability to really like just break your frames open and like basically expose you to a new way of being, on a very visceral level, which is their power. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I have a vast array of thoughts on the topic. And I think that casual or recreational use, I'm not the hugest fan of it. And I'm also modestly opposed to the idea that psychedelics are like the doorway to enlightenment.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Me too.
there's problems in those perspectives, and I've seen people wrecked by them too.
Yeah.
So
Same.
I'm cautious about them, but I have had psychedelic experiences, a reasonable number of them, and
Yeah. I'd be
um,
curious to hear, unless you've already talked
well,
about
I
this
mean, my
before.
first experience was like at 13 with a bunch
Oh
of
wow.
hoodlums. They had some, sheets of acid, but perhaps can't remember if it was the first time or the second time, but I was walking around in urban Stockton, 13-year-old boy, kind of a stoner kid, and I was walking past Greenbelt, right? It's sort of like a space between some of the um, apartment complexes and houses, right? It's like a Greenbelt. And there was a young eucalyptus tree there. And it was as if it literally tapped me on the shoulder and then like this explosion of love, like nothing I'd ever had any experience of in my lifetime just came out of this tree into me.
Wow.
And I realized we're missing out, like we're asleep, like something's wrong. If that's possible for that to happen and we're not having an experience like that, something's like gone terribly wrong, right? And I guess the other thing that was very peculiar was just the you know, I think psychedelics for some people, they lead to certain modes of insight, but it's incredibly difficult to bring that insight back to the other side. Whereas there are other kinds of non-ordinary experiences where it's not difficult. The insight comes easily, right, back with us from the experience. And I tend to have a little more trust of those for some reason.
Yeah. What
I
kind of other
also
non-experiences are you speaking of?
say again.
What
What?
kind of other
Oh,
experiences are you speaking of?
um, I mean, I've had lots of different kinds. The most significant one was an event that lasted 9 months in 2002, where it was like having another, yeah, it was like
Yeah, yeah.
having a highly advanced intelligence that was friendly to humans with my mind at all times. But I've had, let's see, I've had really profound experiences with insects. Um,
Mm,
there was a situation where I was with a dying wasp, and I can't say what actually happened, but what it felt like was that there was a bond arose between us, a very intimate bond instantly. And the wasp like dumped the entire history of her people into my mind and my heart. Right. So like
oh,
massive heroism over huge epochs of time, billions of queens, the cycle of life and death, fighting, the queens fighting for who becomes fertile and facing, forest fires and bears and all of these amazing stories just poured into me as if they were my own story. Um, and once again, after an experience like that, I just feel like, well, what are we doing here? Like, we're not being human yet, right? Like something's very broken if we're not having experiences like this more commonly. Um,
yeah.
so, and then there's dreaming, there's non-ordinary dreaming experiences. So I would sort of say like there's things that happen with nature. These can happen with a body of water, a stream, a river, a lake, the ocean.
Yeah.
There's things that happen with organisms, and there's things that happen with trees, but then there's also things that happen with dreaming. Dreaming
Yeah.
is probably the low hanging fruit of where we can actually get at very profound non-ordinary experience without, for most of us, too much effort. Um, no, I mean, I've had a religious history. I don't know if you have.
Not directly, but my kind of indirectly through my grandparents who were very.
Yeah, so I mean, I was an atheist but interested in magic throughout my young life. Then I had a bizarre Christian conversion experience around the age of 19. There was a span where I was mostly Christian but couldn't hang out with Christians because they seemed like they were insane. Then, I started studying Zen Buddhism around 25, which isn't really a religion. And then things started to complexify after that until I had, the experience in 2002, which pretty much changed everything I'd ever thought about anything. Um, so yeah, I guess I have some trouble with the idea that psychedelics introduces us to insight because I've rarely met someone who could demonstrate insight they've received that way. Maybe rarely isn't even the right word. I think never is probably the right word. This may
Yeah.
seem a little pessimistic, and perhaps you're an exception, right? That's not off, it's not off the
Yeah. I
table.
mean, maybe I can share something now to
Yes, by all
provide
means.
for case study. But before I do that, you said we're not being human yet, which that really struck a chord with me. Like we're not experiencing this. And I feel like with all this, like God is emergent and birthing God and stuff. Well, that frame is great as well, but uh, we're not being human yet is like the core like feeling of it somehow, you know?
Yes, this is one of the things we meshed about immediately when we first began speaking in our earlier conversations. Yes.
Yeah.
Because we
And
want, well, I don't just want, I'm not, yes, of course I want to live my life and have the experience of being full, more fully human, but something's wrong planet wide. Like the humans are in a terrible array of nightmare situations. So there's medicine somewhere for this.
yeah. Yeah, and then so for the psychedelic thing, yeah, it's yeah, I mean I agree with you with the dangers of psychedelics, and yeah, I've also seen many people you know, it kind of wrecks them in different ways. Um so yeah, I don't know. I don't really I'm trying to figure out like what would I want to say about psychedelics as a whole. There's actually nothing. They're just like it's very context dependent, I think, is the
We
only thing I
agree.
can say. Yeah.
Yes.
It's if it works for you, then it works. Or like if it arises, you know, in your context, then it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. If you never take it, it's no issue. Like it's there's no like way of being that is like systematically inaccessible to you. It might be harder, like you know, maybe like ideally you would find another route, but it's not the only path. There's never only one path to something,
Yeah,
including
we
with
agree.
like and yeah, yeah, that does seem like an important frame on them. They're yeah, yeah. There's something I'm trying to say here, which I'm not figuring out what it is. Uh, they're part of life, I think is what I'm trying to say. It's like
Well, okay,
they're not.
I'm going
Wait,
to
wait, but
actually,
let me clarify what
yeah.
I mean by part of life. I don't mean like they're part of life for everyone, but I mean they're like they're not on a different plane of existence from the rest of life, I think is the key thing I'm trying to get at, which I think
Hmm.
is how they're often talked about or interfaced with. Um, but like for example, with my relationship with psychedelics is like when I take a psychedelic, it reveals some new state of being to me, and then in the next like year, usually it's around a year, sometimes longer, shorter. In my day-to-day life, I sometimes systematically and sometimes very chaotically like build towards that state. And
Hmm.
by the end of the year, the state that was revealed to me by the psychedelics has been like in a transmuted form, like just embedded in my day-to-day life.
I've never heard
So
anyone say anything like
it's
that.
not like it's like every time I take it, it's like a new realm and I come back and it's like, you know, it's like separated. It's like going to heaven and coming back or something. It's like in life somehow is I think that's what I'm trying to get at. So which means it's not necessary in order to reach certain states, you know, other paths work. And if you do take it, it's important to, I think, be with it as within life and not treat it as like a different work, a different realm or something like that. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that happens, and it's very surprising, is that much like in dreaming and certain particular states of dreaming, um, there's a feedback that begins to occur where not just our senses, but also what we could refer to as our consciousness, the processes that are normally operating invisibly in consciousness start to interact with their own origin in consciousness, right? So there's a feedback effect so that you have in your vision, for example, you might see things sort of warping or breathing. Yeah. And really, what's probably going on there is straight up that you're having experience of the state of your visual neurons
Right.
before they have completely formed an image. They're forming an image, and the forming, you're having experience of the forming in your visual field, right? So it's like the processes of consciousness start to sort of bend back and interact with themselves. And this is a recipe for magic. I don't necessarily mean, like ritual magic or something like that. I mean, magic is in beyond our common experience. But one of the things you were saying is, no, it's not beyond our common experience. It's part of our common experience. It's one layer there, right? Let them integrate, if I understood.
Yeah, you're also actually literally right about that.
Hmm.
Like he wasn't an advisor, but I almost worked with him, Nigel Goldenfeld, who's a physicist officially, but he does a lot of ecology. Actually gave a talk that I attended where he was literally saying this, that the visual effects on acid are caused by the removal of the suppression
Yes.
of the interference patterns that are already there, which are the same interference patterns that cause zebra stripes. Like in the
Yes.
developmental zebras, it's the
Yes.
same
Yes.
mathematical process, actually.
It's
Yeah.
funny because
Literally, yeah.
I think there were some studies. I work with a neuroscientist, and I have for about 15 years. But I think there were some studies where they did brain scans of people who'd been given psilocybin, and they were expecting to see all this activation. But what they saw was actually areas that are normally highly active, inactive, right? It was
Right.
like, and some of this was the transition from inhibition to open, right? But others of it was like certain things that are normally not inhibited are inhibited, and this was very, very shocking, right? They thought we're going to see wild activation all over the brain, and what they saw was deactivation of certain features and unusual inhibition of other features and things like this.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, we're trapped in the metaphors we're scripted to believe. And so we think that excitement equals activation, for example. Seems like a natural, you know, corollary. One of the things I wanted to suggest, and I'm curious what you think about this. So I'm interested in things that change our minds and also that change our perspectives or our awareness or our consciousness. And you were speaking earlier in a way that I've never heard anyone talk before that was really interesting about language. You were saying that it's like a physical tool, right? It goes inside us, changes our body, changes our minds, the same way that an actual physical thing would. And of course, it's vibrations and it's tempo and it's, you know, tones and this kind of thing. It turns out that after long experiment with language, it looks to me like language can be used as a psychedelic. There are certain ways of playing with language that produce very similar results, at least short term. And then we also have the other truly bizarre elephant in the living room of what the hell is hypnosis? Have you ever been hypnotized?
I haven't actually, no.
Have you ever seen someone hypnotized in front of you?
Not in person, no.
Ah,
Like to, but I haven't yet, no.
yeah, this
But
is one of the
hear about
strangest things I've encountered. I mean, I've studied it for many years now. I'm not an expert, but I've placed people in trance and I've been placed in trance, and
okay.
it's just staggering. I mean, I remember the first time when I had accidentally learned how to hypnotize people and wasn't realizing that I had done so. So I'm like stumbling through my life and this thing happens. But eventually I go to like a hypnosis meetup where they're just going to train you, you know, how to do an induction. And I was pretty skeptical. You know, I'm like, what is this? Yeah, really? But also curious and open-minded. And I remember, you know, they taught us a routine. The routine's pretty universally useful. It doesn't work on everyone, but you know, it works. It's a very simple routine. So we practiced it a little bit. And then it was our turn to be hypnotized. And a woman just stood in front of me and said, "Would you like to feel better right now?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Okay, I'm going to touch you between your eyes. And when you feel my finger touch your forehead, you're going to go immediately into trance." And she went like this, and the whole world changed. Like, I was just like, what is this? I felt so good and like tingly and dreamy and free of like fear and concern, just out it took like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, right?
Does it
And I
always involve
used,
physical action?
yes, in this case,
Is it
this,
always like that though, or
no,
is it
no,
also purely
no,
verbal?
no, you can just talk people right into it.
Wow, that's
Um,
insane.
I mean, my dad came over one time and we were talking about it. And I said, would you like to experience it? And he said, oh, I can't be hypnotized. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, oh, I've been to hypnotists. They couldn't hypnotize me. I said, oh, I can hypnotize you. He said, no, you can't. I said, yes, Dad, I can. And 4 minutes later, he looked like this. And he was like unconscious. His eyes were rolled back in his head.
My
His
God.
arm was like rigid out. I couldn't wake him up. It was
Whoa.
like he'd been anesthetized, right? It took me a long time to get him to come out of it once he was in it. And it was scary because I was like, this is my dad. Wait, did I break my dad? Because normally when you bring someone out, they usually come out right away, unless they're really, really deep in trance. So yeah, I find that to be, if there's an accessible non-ordinary phenomenon for sure. And it's one that religions, the news media, other forms of media take various kinds of advantage of. But what's that about? Why can't you just say a few words to a person and have their whole state change like instantly? I
Yeah.
remember, yeah, I mean, I've had 5 or 6 situations where someone was in physical pain and I could just make it go away. And
Whoa.
I mean, it's not like I'm making it go away. Really, it's them who's making it go away. But I can place them in a state where like they just don't feel the pain anymore. And it doesn't come
Yeah.
back. Right. I mean, sometimes
That's
it does, you know. Right.
Yeah, I'm gonna look into this now. Yeah, I have very little exposure to hypnosis, so I have no answers, unfortunately. But you've
Yeah, well, fair enough. But
sparked a
we were,
curiosity,
one of the things we were talking about is what are some other non-ordinary stuff that you can actually
right?
get at,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And this is some low-hanging fruit. Humans and hypnosis, something really unusual is going on there. Why is there even a feature like that in our consciousness? It's almost as
Yeah,
if there's a built-in feature that wants to transfer authority to an external other under a situation of trust, right? And then once that's done, man, it goes all the way to, you can literally poke holes in someone's veins, right? Hypnotize them, put a little pin in their vein, right? So that it's bleeding. And you can say, okay, stop bleeding, and it stops. And you can say, okay, now bleed again, and it bleeds. It's like that profound.
that's really insane.
That's really bizarre. It's almost
Yeah,
like there's another layer of our humanity going on all the time that we're not aware of.
yeah,
Now, of course, there are stage hypnotists, right? And what those people usually do is they can read a group really well, and they can do a couple of little tests, and they'll find out who's most suggestible from the group, and they'll pick those people, and they'll get those people to come up and do demonstrations with them because it's much, much simpler to hypnotize someone who's more suggestible. Um, and I'm sure, there are people who do things that are fake, but
yeah,
hypnosis is not fake. Hypnosis is it's a real thing. France and
yeah,
humans goes way back, probably before language. And so that's one
yeah,
of the weird things about language possibly being psychedelic, because if I can just say like 5 or 10 words to someone and they're, zonked out and now in some completely different state where they're incredibly suggestible, and I can give them suggestions that they will carry out when they wake up, that looks like some kind of something really crazy to me, because we wouldn't expect that from the way we ordinarily communicate.
yeah. That's maybe next time we talk, I'll have
Yes.
investigated more because I'm very curious now. Yeah,
All
this
right.
is definitely
So
something. But there, speaking of language, there's poetry. I think is another uh,
yes,
modality, and I
I
actually have a
agree.
poetry that's coming out soon, "The Infinitely Pronged Hunger for Life,"
Hmm.
which has this effect to some extent, depending on who you are and what your context is. But already on early readers, it's had some of this state transitioning effect. And a big purpose of that is, well, there's a ton of different overlapping purposes, but and also just non-purposing uh thickness of being, just thickening experience as it is without any purpose. But one of the purposes is kind of flowering out language again into the full internal felt sense of words and metaphors and relations between languages from its hollowing out by, I guess, the thrisps of different, all the different thrists that are trying to eat it alive and make it singular.
Now,
And so yeah, and both with this book I wrote and also with poetry that I've read, yeah, also induce, I would call them psychedelic states, but also they're like permanent state. Like I can read a poem and it, in rare cases, it'll permanently shift my way of being and my perception. Not like hugely like I'm suddenly tripping all the time, but in a pretty significant way. That's yeah, very powerful given that it's
it's
a
true.
fairly
There's something
short
magical. Yeah,
medium.
it's true. There's something magical in the poetry that reaches us,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The stuff that really affects us. I mean, I've been a poet for 40 years and I've written a lot of poetry. Um, but I've also read quite a bit of poetry too, and hung out with poets and wrote together and things like this. Um, when we
That
first
explains a
spoke,
lot. Like I feel like your language has a poetic foundation to it, even when it's not like
yeah,
actual poetry. It's got that foundation.
when I'm at
It's
my
hard to put
best.
words on what that means, but
Yeah,
something
when I'm
about
at my best.
it's language is like a wide open field rather than categorized is the best way I can describe like what it means to have a poetic foundation,
Hmm.
at least in the context of transferring that into non-poetic language. Yeah, and your writing 100% has that flavor to it.
Thank you. It's very kind for you to say so. Um, all right, let's refocus here.
I'm
I
gonna
think, well,
as we talk, shake up the fluid.
oh yeah. So when we first spoke, it seemed like we both have a vision of some of the problems that are facing modern humans. Um, and we both also seem to have at least dreams of what we might be able to do instead, um, or in spite of the situations that we face. Um, and you presented a peculiar and interesting idea about how humans could get together and sort of not resist, but become free together. You seem to have a vision about this. And I have a vision too. I mean, I have a couple of different ones. But do you remember what I'm talking about from our earlier conversation, our first one?
Uh, Prompt me with which aspect
It's
of. I mean, I
almost like you had
would
an
understand
idea
which
to make
aspect
us.
was that.
It was as if you had an idea to make a certain kind of school.
Mm, yeah. Um. Well, if it's the same one, I don't recall the one what I was talking about with you last time. Um, but uh, the vision as it is now, um, I'm trying to find the right way in and being inspired by the grass. Actually, I don't. I'm because I'm trying not to describe it as a conceptual framework. You know what I mean? And to get at the
Sure,
core of it. So give me a moment to uh
of
to
course.
let it percolate.
Yes, take your time.
Yeah, the the core connection that would form the building blocks, I think, of how we can collectively break out of the thrift colonization is initiation rituals. So school, I think, is too it kind of, as a word, in how we currently conceive of it, right? Unreclaimed from the oppressions that have been embedded into that word, is it universalizes a single initiation ritual structure, which is the one that we have currently, through high school. And like there's a bunch of initiation rituals there. And then in college, you have a bunch of initiation rituals, and then adulthood. We're like, society is full of really intense initiation rituals that feel quite normalized to us. Like going to a university is like you're leaving your community and your parents, and you're transferring to the authority of like an institution that is consisting of teachers and administrators, etc. Like it's a very intense initiation ritual. So the
Yes,
word
but it's an institutional initiation.
yeah. So that's why I would avoid the word school to really kind of be
No
clear that
problem.
that
I was
kind
just
of
trying to steer us in the right direction.
that train of initiation rituals is not to be replicated. So it's not like a school that just has like that same, like, for example, you have like summer school, or you have like what's that place called? There's a place in California that's like an alternative college. Well, there's a lot of them, but there's
Yes,
one
there
I'm
are.
thinking
There's a
of.
new college here in the city.
Yeah, there's it's one somewhere in nature. I forget the name, but the
Excellent.
point is that no, not Esalen. Um, I forget. There's also Minerva, and there's all kinds of alternative college structures. But what they all share is that they're still college structures, and they still
Agreed.
replicate that same initiation ritual structure. They
Yes.
just transfer like the content, but they're not transferring they're not changing what we're being initiated into on a fundamental level. And I think that's the key where we want to be focusing, not institutionally, or at least not exclusively. So it's not like, oh, let's build like a new institution that's going to have, initiation rituals that every teenager is going to go through when they turn 18. Not at that level, at least like initially. Maybe that can emerge out of it eventually, but on a more local level. So both in our own lives, like vision quests are a good example, where you go
Mhm.
out into the forest on your own. You can use the structure of a vision quest, like there's a structure, but even if you just go out like the last week, until a few days ago, I was just camping on my own without any like vision quest structure, but it
Mhm.
was still an initiation ritual out of the city where I was living before into not city, with incorporating all that is not city. And it was effective. Like it worked for what I wanted out of it. So kind of improvising initiation rituals as you go through life, and they don't have to come from like Buddhism, and you don't have to just adopt a foreign initiation ritual to
Right.
replace.
You don't have to go to go pick one off the shelf.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can just innovate one on the spot in the way that works for you, individually and collectively. So I've also had spontaneous initiation rituals with friends, which are also really powerful, and they shift our relationship tangibly. Um, and then you can also begin, and a lot of people have done this, to create initiation rituals that are more systematic. So there's a lot of somatic therapy stuff that I find very interesting.
Hmm.
That's actually an area in Western society that's really, really exciting, that I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of. The level of development of somatic therapy and contact improv and different forms of embodiment and relational embodiment between humans is really, in the last 50 years, has like really massively developed, and there's a lot of new stuff emerging now. It's like a really cool area to look into, and profound. Like I feel like historically new. But so things like that is where you start more systematically creating initiation rituals. And I'm also looking in for myself and with some people I'm working with into creating some initiation rituals of different forms.
Hmm.
But the key thing is that the point is not to like find the initiation ritual that we can all participate in to design the key initiation ritual, but to realign our focus to be living with our own initiation rituals as they arise in the context of our life, which maybe are taken off the shelf, right, from other religions. That's totally like I'm doing qigong,
Right.
and that's qigong is obviously coming from Taoism. It's not something I came up with, and that's an amazing initiation ritual for me into grounding and alignment and understanding my energy body, and shifting from being externally focused to being grounded in my internal energy flow.
Mhm.
But so both off the shelf, as well as the thing I just mentioned about going to the forest or hanging out with friends, and then something spontaneous arises. Just attuning to that, and that for me, that is the core of you know initiation ritual by initiation ritual, entering into a new state of being and a form of adulthood that is in the accumulation of all these initiation rituals is substantively and permanently different from and sustainably different from the standard modern human.
What does initiation mean to you?
The transitioning from the state you're currently in, either individually or in a group, so it could be a collective state, into a different state that is like the state that is pulling you.
Hmm.
So if we're all getting older, so that already there's tons of initiation rituals into the next stage of being an older body, an older consciousness, an older mind. Also, our relational structures are changing
Mm-hmm.
with other humans, with the world around us, and also are just internally. We have some kind of experience, like let's say a psychedelic experience or non-ordinary experience, or we fall in love, or stuff happens all the time, which is maybe not related to getting older, but it pulls you into a new state. Like a new state is calling for you to enter it, and then the initiation ritual is where you allow yourself and you or the group to enter the new state and ground in the new state as the centrality. So you're not still in your old state and you're kind of tickling the new state or pulling a little piece. You're really like you're stepping into this new state. Like it's a step rather than like a trickle. That's it really it's like the force and the finality of that transition, I think, is what the initiation ritual, what an initiation is.
It strikes me that a good conversation is a bit of an initiation.
100
Right?
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, there's
And,
scales, right? Like you can
and
have a
just,
huge
of
initiation
course.
and you
Yeah.
have micro initiations. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna wrap up this phase of the interview and we'll be back in about 5 minutes. Yeah.
Well, each one's going faster. It's crazy.
Say again.
Good start. Each one's going faster. It feels like
I
you're distant.
know. All right. See you in 5.